original story narrated exclusively for love written in silence. The room smelled of old paper and candle wax. Edith Marlowe sat at the small writing desk beneath the sloped ceiling, her shoulders aching from hours bent over correspondence. The rain had been falling since dusk, steady and cold, drumming against the single window that overlooked the parish courtyard. She had lived in this room for 3 years now, ever since Mrs. Hartwell had taken her on as reader and copyist. It was not a grand life, but it was hers. She dipped her pen into the inkwell and read over the lines she had written. The letter was addressed to Mr. Thomas Bidwell, a respectable widower who managed a textile concern in the neighboring county. He had written to her twice in the past month, each letter more direct than the last. He was 52 years old. He had 2 grown children who no longer lived at home. He attended church regularly. He had offered her marriage. Edith had accepted, not because she loved him, not because she longed for him, but because at 29 years old, with no family and no inheritance, she understood what the world allowed. Mr. Bidwell was kind. He would provide for her. He would expect little beyond companionship and the management of his household. It was more than many women in her position could hope for. Still, as she sealed the letter, something tightened in her chest. She had written with resigned tenderness, thanking him for his offer and confirming her acceptance. She had been careful to express gratitude without pretending to feelings she did not have. She hoped he would not mind. She suspected he would not. Men like Mr. Bidwell did not marry for passion at his age. They married for order. She reached for the stack of address labels on the corner of her desk. Mrs. Hartwell had asked her to prepare several parcels of correspondence that evening, some for parish business and some personal. The labels were neatly written, but in the dim light and the weariness of the hour, Edith did not look closely. She pressed one onto the envelope, sealed it with wax, and set it aside. The letter was gone by morning, carried away by the postal courier who came each week. Edith returned to her duties. She read aloud to Mrs. Hartwell from the Psalms. She copied out invitations for the parish charity assembly. She mended a torn hymnal. She did not think of the letter again. She did not know that it was traveling not to Mr. Bidwell's modest home in the textile district, but to a stone townhouse in London, where it would be opened by a man she had never met, whose name she knew only from sermons and public record, the Duke of Winthorpe. 3 nights later, the Duke sat in his study, sorting through the day's correspondence. The fire burned low in the grate. His secretary had left hours ago, and the house was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. He preferred these late hours. They gave him time to think without interruption. He opened each letter methodically. Most were routine. Requests for patronage, invitations to dinners he would not attend, reports from his steward in the country. Then he came to a small envelope, sealed with plain wax and addressed in a careful, feminine hand. The return address was unfamiliar. He assumed it was parish business. Mrs. Hartwell, the widow of a clergyman, occasionally wrote to him regarding land records or charitable concerns. He broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The first line made him pause. "Dear Mr. Bidwell," he frowned. This was not meant for him. He should have stopped reading. Protocol demanded it. But something in the tone of the letter held him. The words were honest, almost painfully so. The woman, she did not sign her full name, only her initials, wrote of accepting a marriage proposal. She thanked the recipient for his kindness. She expressed hope that they might build a life of mutual respect, even if it could not be one of great affection. The Duke read the letter twice. There was no melodrama in it, no false sentiment, only a quiet sorrow, carefully contained. She was a woman preparing to marry without love, and she was doing so with clear eyes and a steady hand. He found himself moved, not by passion, but by the dignity of her resignation. He looked at the envelope again. The address was his. The error was obvious now. Somewhere, a woman named E.M. had sent her most private words to the wrong man. He sat back in his chair, the letter resting on his knee. He should return it. He should write a brief note explaining the mistake and send it back unopened. But it was already opened, and the words had already taken root in his mind. He thought of the woman who had written them. He imagined her sitting alone, composing this letter by candlelight, preparing herself for a future that would ask nothing of her heart. He thought of the man who was meant to receive it, this Mr. Bidwell, who would read it and feel satisfied that his offer had been accepted. And he thought of the phrase that lingered most, even if it could not be one of great affection. He stood abruptly. He crossed to the window and looked out at the rain-slicked streets. It was past midnight. No respectable man would call on a woman at this hour, but something in him could not let this pass. He could not explain it, even to himself. He only knew that if he did nothing, he would regret it. He called for his carriage. The journey took 2 hours. The rain grew heavier as they left the city. The coachman asked twice if His Grace was certain of the address. The Duke did not answer. He sat in the darkness of the carriage, the letter folded in his coat pocket, and wondered what he would say when he arrived. The house was small, set back from the road behind a low stone wall. A single light burned in an upper window. The Duke stepped down from the carriage and walked to the door. He knocked. The sound echoed in the stillness. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then he heard footsteps on the stairs. The door opened. A young woman stood before him, wrapped in a shawl, her hair loosely pinned. Her face was pale with shock. She stared at him as if he were a ghost. He held up the letter. "Miss Marlowe," he said quietly, "I believe this was meant for someone else." Edith could not breathe. She recognized him instantly, not because she had ever been introduced to him. She had not, but she had seen him twice before, both times from a distance. Once at a public assembly, where he had spoken on the responsibilities of landowners toward their tenants. Once at a church service, where he had read from the lectern with a voice that carried both authority and restraint. She had never imagined he would stand at her door. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice barely audible. He inclined his head. "Forgive the hour. May I come in?" She stepped back, too stunned to refuse. He entered, rain dripping from his coat onto the worn floorboards. She led him into the small parlor, where the fire had burned down to embers. She did not know what to do. She did not know what to say. He closed the door behind him and turned to face her. He held out the letter. "I opened it believing it was parish correspondence," he said. "I realized my mistake too late. I apologize." Edith took the letter with shaking hands. She looked down at it, at her own words, and felt a wave of humiliation so sharp it made her dizzy. He had read it. He had read everything. "I addressed it incorrectly," she said, her voice tight. "It was not meant for you. I understand that." He paused. "But I could not simply return it and say nothing." She looked up at him, confused. "Why not?" He was silent for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "Because the woman who wrote those words deserves to be heard, even if she did not intend me to hear them." Edith felt her throat tighten. She turned away, moving toward the dying fire. She could not look at him. "You should not have come." "Perhaps not." His voice was steady, calm. "But I am here." She pressed her hands together, trying to steady herself. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing." He said it simply, without hesitation. "I want nothing. I only want you to know that I read what you wrote, and I understood it." She turned to face him. "Understood what?" "That you are preparing to live a half-truth." He spoke without judgment, without pity. "That you have decided to marry a man you do not love, because it is the only choice that makes sense. That you are a woman of intelligence and honesty, and you are about to silence yourself forever." Edith felt something crack inside her. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, but she could not. "What else am I to do?" she whispered. He looked at her for a long moment. "I do not know, but I know this. A heart that writes such words should not be silent forever." The fire crackled softly. The rain continued its steady rhythm against the window. Edith stood in the center of the small room, the letter clutched in her hands, and felt something she had not felt in years. She felt seen, not as a dependent woman, not as a burden or a charity case, but as a person whose inner life mattered, whose words had weight, whose silence was a loss. The Duke moved toward the door. "I will not intrude further, but I wanted you to know." He paused, his hand on the latch. "The marriage you have accepted, is it already decided?" "It is expected," she said quietly, "but not yet confirmed." He nodded. "Then you still have time." "Time for what?" He looked at her, and for the first time she saw something unguarded in his expression. Time to choose what you truly want. He opened the door and stepped out into the rain. Edith stood alone in the parlor, the letter in her hands, and listened to the sound of his carriage pulling away. She did not move for a long time. When she finally looked down at the letter, she saw her own words, as if for the first time, even if it could not be one of great affection. She folded the letter carefully and set it on the table. Then she sat down by the fire and wept. The days that followed were strange and disorienting. Edith tried to return to her routine, but everything felt different. She woke each morning with the memory of the Duke's words ringing in her mind. She went about her duties, reading to Mrs. Hartwell, copying correspondence, attending to the small tasks that filled her days. But her thoughts were elsewhere. She found herself thinking about him. Not in the way a young girl might dream of a nobleman. She was too old for that, too practical. But she thought about the man who had stood in her parlor in the middle of the night, soaked with rain, holding her letter as if it were something precious. She thought about the restraint in his voice, the absence of pity, the way he had spoken to her as an equal. She began to ask questions, quietly, carefully. She learned that the Duke of Winthorpe was 36 years old, that he had inherited his title at 23, after his father's death, that he was known for his refusal to use his rank for personal advantage, that he had once turned down a lucrative marriage alliance because he believed the terms were unjust to the woman involved. She learned that he rarely attended society events, that he spent most of his time managing his estates and advocating for reforms in land law, that he had a reputation for fairness and moral clarity that was unusual among men of his station. She realized, with a strange jolt, that she had admired him for years, not romantically, but as a model of the kind of character she valued. She had kept a clipping from a newspaper, a report of a speech he had given on justice and the dignity of those without rank. She had underlined a single phrase: "Character is not inherited, it is chosen." Now, sitting in her small room with the letter on her desk, she wondered what it meant that he had come to her. She wondered what he expected. She wondered what she was supposed to do. Her engagement to Mr. Bidwell loomed over her like a shadow. He had written again, asking when they might meet to discuss the arrangements. She had not yet replied. Each time she sat down to write, the words would not come. At a church gathering the following Sunday, Mrs. Hartwell's niece mentioned, in passing, that she had seen a ducal carriage on Edith Street the previous week. The question was delicate, curious. Edith deflected, saying it must have been lost. But the seed of rumor was planted. She could feel the weight of it, the quiet scrutiny, the whispers that would follow if anyone learned the truth. And still, she could not bring herself to confirm the engagement. 2 weeks after the Duke's visit, Edith was cataloging donations in the parish library. It was a small room, lined with shelves of old books and records. The light was dim, and the air smelled of dust and paper. She worked alone, sorting through volumes that had been left by parishioners over the years. She was reaching for a book on the top shelf when it slipped from her grasp and fell to the floor. The pages scattered. She knelt to gather them, and as she did, something else fell from the shelf. A small volume of Psalms, bound in worn leather. She picked it up and opened it. Inside, carefully preserved between the pages, was a newspaper clipping. She recognized it immediately. It was the article she had saved years ago, the one reporting the Duke's speech on justice and dignity. She stared at it, her heart pounding. She had forgotten she had placed it here. She had forgotten she had kept it at all. And then she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. The Duke stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He was dressed simply, without the formality she had expected. He looked tired. "Your Grace," she said, standing quickly, "I did not know you were here." "I came to review the land records," he said. "A matter of historical boundary disputes. The parish keeps better records than the county office." She nodded, unable to speak. He moved past her, toward the far shelf where the records were kept. She turned back to the Psalms, trying to steady her breathing. But as she moved to replace the book on the shelf, it slipped again. This time, the Duke was closer. He stepped forward and caught it before it fell. He looked down at the open pages, at the clipping, at the phrase she had underlined in her own hand. "Character is not inherited. It is chosen." He was very still. He looked up at her, and she saw something shift in his expression. Recognition, understanding, and something else, something that looked like sorrow. "You kept this," he said quietly. She could not lie. "Yes, why?" She hesitated. "Because I believed it. Because I wanted to believe that a person could choose to be more than what the world expected of them." He closed the book carefully and handed it back to her. "And do you still believe it?" "I do not know," she whispered. "I thought I did. But now I am not sure I have the courage." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back, putting distance between them. "You have more courage than you know, Miss Marlowe. But courage is not the same as certainty." He turned and walked to the shelf of records. He did not look at her again. He pulled down a ledger and began to read, his back to her, his posture rigid. Edith stood holding the book of Psalms, her hands trembling. She understood, in that moment, what he was doing. He was withdrawing, not because he did not care, but because he cared too much. Because any gesture from him, any word, any glance, could tilt her decision unfairly. He was giving her the space to choose freely. She set the book back on the shelf and left the library without another word. That night, alone in her room, she understood the full weight of what had happened. He had seen the clipping. He knew she had carried his words with her for years. And instead of using that knowledge, instead of pressing his advantage, he had stepped back. She had never known a man to do such a thing. The rumor spread slowly, but it spread. A noblewoman at a charitable tea mentioned the Duke's unusual visit to the parish. Mrs. Hartwell, ever kind but ever curious, asked Edith gently if there was anything she should know. Edith deflected, but she could see the worry in the older woman's eyes. And then Mr. Bidwell wrote. His letter was polite, measured, but the subtext was clear. He had heard whispers. He had heard that the Duke of Winthorpe had called on her. He did not accuse, but he asked with strained courtesy whether their engagement still stood. Edith sat at her desk, the letter in her hands, and felt the walls closing in. She was on the edge of losing her security. If she did not reassure Mr. Bidwell, he would withdraw his offer. And if he did, she would have nothing. No home, no income, no future. She picked up her pen. She dipped it in ink. She began to write, "Dear Mr. Bidwell," and then she stopped. Something in her would not let her continue. Some small, stubborn part of her that refused to lie. She set the pen down. She stared at the blank page. She did not write. The next day, Mr. Bidwell wrote again. This time, his tone was cooler. He asked for a final answer within the week. He said he understood if circumstances had changed. He said he would not hold her to an agreement she no longer wished to keep. Edith folded the letter and placed it in her desk drawer. She did not reply. The Duke had not returned. He had not written. His absence felt deliberate, careful. She understood why. He was making sure that whatever she decided, it would be her decision alone. But his absence also felt like a loss. The week passed in agonizing slowness. Edith moved through her days like a ghost. She prayed, not for guidance, but for courage. She prayed for the strength to choose truth over safety. She prayed for the wisdom to know what truth even was. Mrs. Hartwell grew concerned. She asked if Edith was unwell. Edith said she was only tired. Mrs. Hartwell did not press, but her kindness made it everything harder. On the 6th day, Edith sat alone in her room and forced herself to think clearly. She thought about her life. She thought about the choices she had made, the compromises she had accepted. She had always chosen safety over truth. She had always chosen duty over desire, not out of cowardice, but out of necessity. But now, the thought of confirming her engagement to Mr. Bidwell felt like a betrayal, not of the Duke, but of herself. She realized, with a clarity that was almost painful, that the letter had not been a mistake. It had been the truth she had been avoiding. She wanted to be loved for who she truly was, not for her usefulness, not for her respectability, but for herself. She did not yet know what she would do. But for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine another future. A future where she did not have to silence herself. A future where she could choose. The 7th day arrived. The deadline. Edith woke before dawn. She dressed slowly, carefully. She did not know what would happen. She only knew that she could not lie anymore. She sat at her desk and wrote a single line to Mr. Bidwell. "I cannot accept your offer. I am sorry." She sealed the letter and set it aside. Then she sat in the silence and waited. The knock came just after dawn. Edith was still sitting at her desk, the letter to Mr. Bidwell beside her. When she heard it, she stood, her heart pounding, and went to the door. The Duke stood on the threshold. He was alone, no carriage in sight. He looked as if he had walked through the early morning streets. His coat was damp with mist. His expression was solemn. He held something in his hand. The letter, her letter, but it was sealed again, carefully, with his own ducal crest pressed into new wax. "Miss Marlowe," he said quietly. "May I come in?" She stepped back. He entered, and she closed the door behind him. They stood in the small parlor, the morning light pale and thin through the window. He held out the letter. "I wanted you to have this again, unopened, as it was meant to be." She stared at it. "I do not understand." "The letter belongs to your future," he said, "not your past. I have stayed away these weeks deliberately, so that no decision of yours would be made because of me, so that you would have the space to choose freely." She took the letter from him, her hands trembling. "And if I choose Mr. Bidwell, then I will respect it, and I will never speak of this again. And if I choose otherwise," he looked at her, and she saw the depth of feeling in his eyes, "then I will wait. A year, 2. However long it takes for there to be no question of impropriety or pressure. No word from me should alter your path." He turned to leave. Edith looked down at the letter. The seal was unbroken. It was as if the mistake had never happened, as if she could go back to the moment before everything changed. But she could not. She did not want to. Slowly, deliberately, she broke the seal. She opened the letter. She read her own words. The words she had written in resignation, in quiet despair. The words that had brought him to her door. She looked up. He had stopped at the threshold, his hand on the door. "I will not choose safety over truth," she said. He turned. She folded the letter and set it on the table. "I would like to know you, not as a dream, not as an ideal, as a man." He crossed the room in 3 strides. He took her hand, formally, gently. "Then we will begin rightly, with time, with honesty, with no secrets." She nodded, unable to speak. "I will not call on you alone again until there can be no question of propriety," he said. "We will meet in company. We will write letters. We will take the time to know each other, truly. And if, at the end of that time, you still wish it, I will ask you properly. And if I do not, then I will have had the honor of knowing you. And that will be enough." The church bells rang for matins. The sound was clear and bright in the morning air. The Duke released her hand and stepped back. "I will write to you this week," he said. "A real letter. Honest, without pretense. I will reply," she said. He smiled just slightly. Then he turned and left. Edith stood in the parlor, the opened letter on the table, and felt something she had not felt in years. She felt free. 1 year passed, then another. The waiting was deliberate, public, irreproachable. Mr. Bidwell, with wounded dignity, withdrew his offer and remarried within 6 months. Mrs. Hartwell, after initial shock, came to respect Edith's courage. She even confided, late one evening, that she wished she had made such a choice in her own youth. The Duke and Edith met in carefully appropriate settings, parish events, charitable assemblies, always in company. They spoke of books and ideas. They debated theology and philosophy. They discovered that they disagreed on many things, and that disagreement only deepened their respect for one another. They wrote letters, real ones, thoughtful, honest, unguarded. He told her about his childhood, about the weight of inheriting a title he had not wanted. She told him about her parents' deaths, about the years of dependence that had shaped her. They did not hide from each other. They did not pretend, and slowly, over months and seasons, something grew between them. Not passion, not infatuation, but something deeper, something that felt like coming home. When he finally presented her formally, as his intended, no one could question the propriety of it. The waiting had been long enough. The courtship had been public enough. She was introduced not as a rescued woman, but as a partner chosen with full awareness and time. The wedding was small, quiet, held in the same parish church where Edith had once catalogued books and copied hymns. Mrs. Hartwell wept. The Duke's steward stood as witness. Edith wore a simple dress of ivory silk, and the Duke wore no ceremonial regalia. They spoke their vows clearly, without hesitation. Afterward, they traveled to a country house on the edge of the Duke's estate. It was modest by noble standards, comfortable, bright. The sitting room had a wide window that overlooked a garden. The writing desk was positioned to catch the morning light. Edith stood at that desk on their first morning as husband and wife. She looked down at a fresh sheet of paper, a pen, an inkwell. She smiled. She began to write. My dearest, it was a letter to him, though he was only in the next room. A habit they had kept. Some things were worth writing down. Some truths were best sealed and opened and chosen again and again. She wrote for a long time. When she finished, she sealed the letter carefully and set it on the table beside the door. Then she went to find him. He was in the garden, standing beneath an old oak tree, his coat unbuttoned, his face turned toward the sun. He looked younger than she had ever seen him. He looked at peace. She walked toward him, and he turned. He smiled. Did you finish your letter? He asked. I did. May I read it? Later, she said. For now, just walk with me. He offered his arm. She took it. They walked together through the garden, the morning light spilling over them, the bells ringing faintly in the distance. Inside the house, on the table by the door, 2 coats hung side by side. A sealed letter waited to be opened. And outside, in the world they had chosen together, the day stretched long and full of promise. It was not an ending. It was a beginning. Earned, deliberate, free.